Podcasters Roundtable round 69, podfading. Of course, I don't know. Are we going to need to explain what podfading is? You'll either get the gist, you either know, or you'll find out real fast. We will explain it. Maybe it means something different to each one of you. I don't think so. I think it has a pretty strict definition. Daniel usually keeps us on par when it comes to definitions, so we'll check the grammar, the definitions, the whole thing. But at some point, as a podcaster, you're going to have to stare down the idea of podfading. That is, to stop your podcast. Now, sometimes it's not a choice. Sometimes you just go away. I mean, maybe this is the last round we ever do and we never show up again. We will have podfaded. We just went away, right? How you do that is a different story. But, I think I put it in the description. At some point, if you don't decide, time will decide for you, right? The podcast will end. I'm sorry. Well, I mean, someone could pick up the stick, have kids, make them do the show, really will it to them, put that burden on them. Hey, you have to do this show forever. So pod fading, almost inevitable, and we're going to have a conversation about that. We have definitely addressed that here on Podcasters Roundtable before. We had a round on making tough decisions, and we talked a little bit about that, but we didn't talk about all the stuff that sort of surrounds it. And we'll see if we have an hour's worth here in maybe about 45 minutes of pod fading. But of course, Podcasters Roundtable, we can jump to any subject at any time. It's just a conversation amongst friends. And speaking of friends, let's meet the Roundtable co-host Daniel J. Lewis. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. I have lived podfade for nearly 2 years, and it's exciting to talk about something that I think affects all podcasters, and that's what this podcast is all about.
We got Mario working his way in here. Little technical difficulties, but it doesn't stop us. We roll and we work him in as it goes. So I'll mute him, and then he's unmute himself. You got audio there, Mario? I don't see any audio. Oh wait, you're muted. Unmute. All right, Dave Jackson, welcome back, co-host Dave Jackson.
Yeah, Dave Jackson, schoolofpodcasting.com, podfader in training. I have lots of opportunity to podfade, and I'm horrible at it. Well, I think I am, but I'm not. I can't do that final episode to say I'm done. I'm never coming back.
It can be very tough, tough. And in some cases, we don't. We don't do the final episode, or maybe we think we're coming back, and it doesn't happen. But all right, we will. Mario, do you have audio?
It's not showing my mic.
That's okay. It sounds good enough. We'll take it, whatever we're getting. And Mario, welcome to your first roundtable. It's been a long time.
Thank you. It has. I started watching Podcasters Roundtable a long time ago, and so I think I mentioned the pod fading thing is one of the very first. I think it was probably within your first 10 episodes. Is that when you were starting to take suggestions as well?
Yeah, I think it's always kind of been open for suggestions, but I mean, Mario, and you'll meet Roberto here in a second, these two guys have been on this list, I think, for years. So the fact that A, they still have podcasts, haven't podfaded, B, we're still here, and then C, who finally got them on, that they're still around, is amazing. So thank you guys so much. That is what I'm trying to accomplish over the next few rounds. I'm really digging back all the way and seeing who the heck has not been on this show. And I feel like I've been lining up topics with whatever people have suggested and picking those. But I'm going to go and I'm going to force the topics based on people who have been waiting because it's just been too long. So thank you so much, Roberto, another person who's been on the list for so long. Thanks for sticking with us here at the Roundtable.
Yes, I'm happy to be here. I don't know how many of you are Blade Runner fans, but there's a famous quote there that the candle that burns twice as bright burns twice as fast. And I feel like sometimes when it comes to podcasting, if you try to do too much, that may be what gets you into that pod fading moment of having to consider cutting back or saying goodbye to a podcast, which is kind of a position that I've had to be in recently, but I think it's gotten me to a better place when it comes to podcasting. There can be good that can come out through the process of admitting that it's time to let a podcast go.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue for us to jump right in because every podcaster, I feel, not every podcaster, that obviously is too broad, but a lot of podcasters, when we start this thing, super exciting, right? You have a ton of ideas. the first few episodes, no problem, right? You're sailing off the top of your head, maybe. It's really easy. You've only done a couple episodes, so it's been like 3 weeks, maybe a couple months, and you haven't been in the grind. It hasn't been a year, so maybe you start another show, maybe 3 shows, because you're like, this stuff is great, right? It's awesome. And I think what you talked about, burning twice as bright, right, and burning out, that much faster is a good point. Now, has anyone, Roberto, you're saying that's a great movie, great quote, great book. Are you? Wait, is Blade Runner A Dream of Electric Sheep, that one, Androids?
Yes.
Yeah, I read the book before I saw the movie. It was awesome. All right, so anyways, is that just a cool quote, or did you ramp up too soon in the beginning?
I tried to do too much too soon in the beginning. Part of it was I got into podcasting because I wanted to do something based on a TV show. There was a TV show, some of you may know it, called Spartacus, Blood and Sand, and I was a big fan of the show, and I was concerned that it was going to get canceled. So I figured, well, maybe I looked in iTunes and other podcast directories and saw that nobody was doing a podcast to just recap and talk about that show. And so I decided to start a show on that. And then I liked it so much, I decided, hey, maybe I can do something else. And so I started another podcast on movie trailers. It was called Trailer Clash. And then through the connection of the Spartacus podcast.
I like the name, Trailer Clash. It's a good name. Did you get the domain for that one?
I do. I have it.
You still have it. Wait, did that pod fade?
That one has pod faded,
but you still kept the domain.
But I kept the domain.
There's a lesson in there too, right? Keep the domain at least if you're going to take off, right? Because what happens when you decide to come back? It's gone.
Exactly. And then what I decided, that wasn't on technically it's on hiatus, so it's not that it's gone away completely, but it's on hiatus.
Sure. Yeah, we believe you.
Yeah. And then of course through the Spartacus podcast, I connected with a fellow podcaster who also did TV podcasts. And he invited me to join him on a Game of Thrones podcast. So I was juggling 3 podcasts while, like you said, family responsibilities and work and many other things. And so it did come a point where I was just doing too much, and I had to reevaluate and decide what can I manage.
Okay, so how did you choose which one to let go of?
One of them was a decision that was out of my control. Spartacus was canceled, so that made it easy canceling that podcast. Trailer Clash, what I found with Trailer Clash, the whole premise of the show with Trailer Clash was I'm a big movie fan who doesn't have time to go to the movies. So instead of reviewing movies, we just reviewed the movie trailers. That was kind of the gist of that. But what happened was it was such a topical thing. You have to really be on top of it every week, and it was just too much of a grind. And what I found is that doing something either around a TV show or a theme that you could do it on a more seasonal basis. Like, for example, the one podcast that I continue to do is my Game of Thrones podcast, because it lasts for about 3 months. I do it. I kind of go through the grind during those 10 weeks that the show is on, and then I can take a break. I felt that with Trailer Clash, there was never a natural stopping point where I could just say, okay, it's time to kind of give it a break here.
Yeah, but each episode's only like 37 seconds long, right?
You would think so. You would think so, but unfortunately, no. We would do about 5 trailers per episode and discuss them and whatnot. And what I found is, with podcasting, I'm very good when it comes to the production and creation side. I'm not that good with the marketing and promotional side, and so I was having a lot of difficulty justifying investing so much time in this and not really being able to focus on building the audience part. So I figured, let me put that one on hold and focus on the Game of Thrones podcast, which I still continue to do, which we've been able to build a decent audience following and a good community that gives feedback, and just kind of focus my energies on that.
Yeah, it's so funny because when I typed up the title of this one, I switched them because I got a suggestion that, hey, Podcasters Roundtable in the beginning, can't really see. You run out of characters. This is a podcasting thing. Best practice you may or may not want to do. And so the title's up front now, and it says pod fading it's a pod fading / Podcasters Roundtable. So it's like, I was like, oh, people are going to think this is it, man. We are pod fading. And sure enough, in the chat.
Thank you, good night.
That's it. Emily and Stargate Pioneer, they're like, just to be clear, you're not pod fading, right? So Dave had a little fun with that, saying,
I'm honored to be on the last episode.
This is it. We peaked. I went and reached way back in the archive, grabbed the oldest for the last.
It should have been the April 1st episode. And then
yes, that would have been good. That would have been good. I like it.
Well,
so no,
I think
we are not
that raises the question, though. What is pod fading? Because I hear, even in our discussion, two different definitions of pod fading.
Cool. What are you hearing?
Well, I hear pod fading, and I've heard I don't know who exactly on the panel said this so far, but one version is pod fading is when you end a show. The other version, and this is what I go with, is pod fading is when a show, pod fading is not something you do. It's the term to describe what happens, or rather doesn't happen. It's when when a show fades out of existence because you cease to publish episodes, or you get slower on your production and eventually just fades off into existence. You never ended it. It just died. That's how I define pod fading. So which one are we talking about? Ending a show, or are we talking about when a show fades to death?
Yeah, I would say we could blend them because we have 45 minutes. So unless it is good to talk about both. And so I think there is a distinction. I mean, just listen to the term pod fade as something it just sort of kind of goes away, right? And not necessarily like you're saying this is the final episode, or you did a series, like you meant it to be 10 episodes. You're not really pod fading at that point, probably. So good distinction there. I definitely have a show that pod faded. Like Dave said, I never said goodbye, and I always intended to, and I thought at the least there would be this last episode. It was my first podcast, and it just kind of went away. The Facebook page is still there, and nothing's been updated in years. And people, and I'll say, yeah, sorry, the show it's probably not coming back. But, I still think it would be fun to do a final episode and put it in the feed and be like, what? People are like, what is going on? Although, you know what? I think now having the access to Podcast Connect, I don't even think the show's in iTunes anymore. So iTunes decided for me, like Father Time. Dave.
Well, I think it's funny because I'm looking at a show that I was thinking it's probably been, a couple months. I thought probably January was the last time I did an episode. November of 2015. It's one of those where you go, yeah, I'm just going to... And what's hilarious is I did a part 1 of an interview. I never did part 2, and not a single person has said, hey, where's part 2?
Yeah, sadly, a lot of times I'll toss stuff out there kind of hoping that it'll get some traction, and if it doesn't, it kind of just goes away. I'm guilty of that, for sure. This raises another good question, because I feel like I'm constantly treading the pod fading line with the Podcaster Studio. There will go months without an episode, and it's been like that for like the last year, and that's tough. It's not going away. I will put one in, but how long, right? How long do you go away and then come back? Have you pod faded and come back? Can you come back from a pod fade, right? Is that such a thing? All right, how does that work? So Mario, you kind of shake your head like, yeah, maybe. What are you thinking?
Well, I run 2 shows, the 210 Local Media podcast and the It's a Guy Thing podcast. And the It's a Guy Thing podcast is just me and a couple of buddies, and we just talk about whatever topics, honestly, we come up with in 5 minutes before we hit record. And that one, it's difficult. You got 3 different people. You've got different schedules. You got families and everything. And it's easy to go months without being able to meet up. And we've probably faded out for multiple months at a time, when I think our longest gap was about 9 months. And so our first episode back, we're back, and then we disappeared for another few months. So, I mean, it's one of those things that dependent upon the podcast itself, and if you have co-hosts, I think it's really difficult to kind of balance that out. So pod fading is probably easier for people to do when it comes to that.
Not a turtle. It's a bike helmet with a tea kettle pot. So the chat is asking, they're playing What's Behind Ray. It's really dark back there. So if you listen to the audio-only version, there's random stuff on my counter. So yeah, come check it out. It's not a turtle. It's really slow moving. So yeah, I mean, what do we think? Dave or Daniel or whoever wants to answer, how long can we be gone? Can you come back from a pod fade? Obviously, yeah, it's a good question, I guess. I'll leave it there.
You can always come back. Will you come back to the level you were at before you left? That's, I've lost probably 70% of my audience for, in this case, it's the Marketing Musician podcast, where I used to get, 1,000 or so downloads, and I think the last time I put on an episode, it was like 400, 300, and I was like, ooh. But they got tired of waiting, which is funny because, what does it take to have your podcatcher keep checking? Nothing.
Nothing.
I think it's just one of those where they get tired of looking at it, and I don't know, maybe it's the disappointment that is they just figure you left, so why should I keep checking? But you could always start it back up, and then from there it's going to be climbing your way back out.
Yeah. Oh, and in some cases, like I said, iTunes literally deleted my show, and what happened is it was a video podcast. The platform that I was hosting my video on went away, so there was, I guess, nothing in my feed. I don't know, Daniel, what do you think? I didn't delete the show, but they saw nothing going on there.
Apple will not. We talked about this recently in a separate group. Apple has on their FAQ page or somewhere a description of when they will remove an old podcast, and essentially as long as a podcast feed is valid and it has episodes, it will never be removed from iTunes no matter how old it is. Now, Apple does say if it hasn't released an episode recently, or they give some vague term, so we don't know how recently, but let's say a year. It doesn't say a year, but let's just assume that. If you don't release an episode within a year, then they do say they won't feature the podcast anywhere. So in a What's Hot or a Top Picks or anything like that. And that makes sense. They want to feature people who are current. Going to your question, though, to say how long is it before we consider something pod faded, I think 3 or 6 months without an episode, to me, that's pod faded. Unless it's an intentional thing, like a TV show fan podcast that has a summer hiatus for the TV show. So there I would say 6 months if they go 6 months without an episode. But yeah, about somewhere around there. Now for me, in my podcast app, before I switched to an audio-only podcast app, I was still subscribed to Ask a Ninja. I was holding out hope.
That's great. I love it. Yeah.
I was holding out hope for another episode. I think I stayed subscribed for 3 years with nothing coming through.
I forgot about. I love that show. I was subscribed too. Yeah, for sure. Everyone. If you were around the beginning, man, that is an iconic, groundbreaking show for our space. So yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
So since we were sort of doling out some Apple tips there, and you have some knowledge on that one, Daniel, I guess let's talk about that same related issue where, again, if you don't have something in the feed within X amount of time, then like the iTunes podcast app will stop checking it, right? How does that work?
No, the app will not pause a subscription, and that's the key word we need to use is pause. It doesn't unsubscribe people. It pauses their subscription. The app, the Apple Podcast app, that is, won't pause someone's subscription unless they have not listened to an episode, one of the last 5 episodes.
So the listener faded. You listen faded. So when your listener bails on your show, they stop getting it, or they don't stop getting it, but they have to. What happens? How do they get a new one when they decide to come back?
They have to interact with it in some way, like either they tap on the banner that says your subscription has been paused, tap here to resume, or listen to one of your downloaded episodes.
So iTunes is telling them. They're actually making them. It's not just kind of like what I get, because from their end, it could be like, well, nothing new is coming out from this. They could think you pod faded, but not. They're telling. I don't feel like it always told you, but maybe it has.
Now, I forget which way how it works if you delete the episodes, because there might be a podcast you're subscribed to, and for whatever reason, you don't listen to any of the last 5 episodes, but you do delete them. I think it still counts that as no interaction.
WTF? I have my podcatcher, but I cherry pick by name, so it could be 8 episodes, 20 episodes before I even click. I mean, I'm just delete, right? So it goes a long time, but I always get the new one.
As an interaction.
Yeah, it must, because I always get the new one.
Okay.
I don't know. It's a good question. Hey, we always find stones to overturn. Like, well, there's something else for us to go research. Daniel's pretty good doing that. So
speaking of research, let me read what it actually says on Apple's site. So it says podcasts with technical problems or without any episodes will be removed. If you do not update your podcast with new episodes, your podcast may disappear from some areas of the iTunes Store, but will continue to be available via search on the iTunes Store and in the podcast app. So may disappear from some areas if you don't update your podcast with new episodes. It's a lot of vague language there.
It's a lot.
And those areas may be things like what you mentioned earlier, Daniel, the showcase, having kind of highlighting of an episode. Granted, for those of us who have never been highlighted in any way, I guess it doesn't make that much of a difference.
Wait. This is huge. This is a huge problem. You mean I might not be a new and noteworthy?
That's it.
My show is doomed. Right? You guys, if we don't get new and noteworthy, it's over.
It's over. That's it.
Forget it. Hang up the mic.
You start your podcast over again and resubmit with a different feed.
Yes. Genius idea. Do you hear the sarcasm, people? If this is your first round, we are being so sarcastic. Do not do this. New and noteworthy is a big... Don't worry about it. Please don't worry about it. All right. So when we're considering, okay, so I mentioned I had a show. It went away. And you always kind of thought, hey, maybe there'll be an episode. And then it was deleted because it was taken care of for me because, like I said, the platform was gone. So there was no media file in the thing. If we are going by pod fading where it just goes away, does anyone else, who else, I think, Dave, who else meets that definition? Well, how about Mario or Roberto? Did you say goodbye? I guess that's the question.
No, I did. In my case, I did very deliberately. We had to say goodbye. I mean, we had a final episode. Now, one of them, it did become one of those things where I had said on the I guess in the penultimate episode, hey, I'm taking a break and we'll be back. And then it went for a while, and I realized I don't really want to come back. So then I just did like a little blip of an episode just to say, hey, listen, I've decided not to continue doing this. And so I did feel at least obligated to put a final cap on it. But it did fade for a while until I decided, okay, it's time to at least put the word out there that I'm officially ending the show. So. I guess the other piece that I wanted to address was when it comes to fading, I guess I was also defining pod fade as kind of just me as the podcaster fading out. That there is sometimes a sense that I've expended all the energy I can focusing on this, and so maybe it's not about so much the fading out of the podcast, just the fading out of me being able to continue investing into this podcast.
Right, or I mean, you can pod fade on microphone, meaning that like you're still producing episodes, but man, you are gone. You checked out, right? I mean, here's the thing. If you go long enough, you're going to have episodes like that. I mean, some episodes are just not going to be as good as others. Dave, can you remember, have you ever turned on the microphone and then afterwards was like, that was terrible?
Mm-hmm. I've had the ones where I'm like, that was not your best. Usually it's like, well...
Do you not know when you get off I know when the recording's over. Like, I'll go to my wife and be like, that was a good one. She's probably like, you're crazy. But it feels good, or Like, I've had... Let's put it this way. We've done roundtables. This happens every roundtable, where as soon as I hit stop broadcast, I'm like, yeah, it just wasn't the best, Don't worry, we're doing okay on this one. But we've had a couple big names on this show, and I thought they were, from my perspective, just not the best. I mean, the best does not always come from where you think it's going to be. So, Dave, you've been there too, and I'm going to assume you have episodes out there that you published. This goes down to the whole thing of, is it more important to be there every week, or would you rather wait a week and produce a better episode?
Well, until Mark Maron had the president, the guy that held the record for most downloads per episode was Dan Carlin with Hardcore History, and that guy breaks every rule there is.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't have any schedule, and when he does come out, they're like 3 to 4 hours long. And so, but people love it. I mean, he gets thousands of downloads per second, probably. So that would say, you don't have to. But on the other hand, I know when you can have a schedule and meet it. I have people that, Dave, I'm with you every Monday when I'm going to such and such. They start to work you into their routine. That's the bonus of that. So when they can't count on you, it's not that they don't they don't well, when they can't count on you, they don't count on you. They just kind of squeeze you in whenever they have some free time, and nobody has free time. So yeah, so then they pod fade.
And Stargate Pioneer in the chat, he said, if you pod fade, do you owe your listeners a farewell episode? But that does that sort of tread the line of it's if you can't give them a farewell episode if you pod faded, right?
Right.
You went
Well,
away.
I think you could.
Or do you realize it and
acknowledge it.
come back, right? Do you
Exactly.
realize you like, you know what? I did pod fade. Let me put something in the feed, right? Maybe that's what we're talking about.
Just to make it final, right? Just to let people know, yeah.
To know, hey, this
I'm
is
gone.
not coming back. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Thank you, by the way.
Yeah. And I think that's really a great strategy, because if you say, I'm not doing this show anymore, but I am going to start this new one over here, you can take that relationship you have and just continue it someplace else. Because I'm finding out, I used to have people that listen to the Marketing Musician podcast that weren't musicians. And I'm like, what do you listen to the show for? Oh, I just like to listen to what you're doing and what you think. And I was like, really, that's kind of weird. So a lot of times they're tuning into you, not so much your topic.
Yeah.
And so if you can give them some place to go, they might, especially for me, I think a lot of my I hate that word, but avatar is a lot like me. So if I start doing something that fits people of my age group and my kind of demographic, well, they're probably going to want to do that too. So
Even
Your
if you
avatar is you, Dave. Your avatar is you. Your audience's avatar. Sorry, that's one of
Right.
my pet peeves in this podcasting space. It's not your avatar we're talking about. It's your audience's avatar.
That's true. That's true.
Good point.
Even if you call them weird, Dave, you called your audience weird. But no, that's an excellent point because, yeah, you are your avatar. That's an excellent point because here's the thing. Because as you're saying that, I'm thinking, well, my first show was about fresh fruits and vegetables, and my next show is about podcasting. Like there's zero connection. But their last round, we had someone on this show who followed a music show that I produced. I wasn't even on the microphone. He followed it, and now he was on the Roundtable, which is incredible. Jeff, last round. You don't know. I mean, you don't know who's listening. You don't know why they're listening. Don't make assumptions, right? So I think that what you're saying about telling them, hey, I'm doing this other thing. Now, some people leave podcasting altogether, but I think most people do probably go on to something else. I don't know. What do you think, Mario, in terms of?
I don't think we can get away from it. I think if you're a podcaster, you're kind of a podcaster for life. There's not many people that I know that have just totally left the space altogether. They stay active in one way or another, or they have opinions about other podcasts and they offer that up. I think if I were to give up producing a podcast, I would find a way to help somebody with their own, or I would find a way to be a guest on other podcasts. I don't think I could leave it altogether.
Yeah, so I mean, just the fact that you submitted so long ago means you've been doing a podcast for a while now. How many shows have you done?
I've had 3 separate shows. The first one ran for 10 episodes, and I told them, hey, we had a budget. We're at the end of our budget. This is the official last episode. And I fed that one back into the first one that I started. And that one is, we just released episode number 76. So it's been about 3 years, and then the other podcast, the It's a Guy Thing podcast, which is very sporadic, no schedule. That one I think we just released episode 26. So, and that one I started maybe 8 months after the first one. So you can tell there's a big difference in episode numbers for those.
Yeah, and so I mean, when for interview, when one is, I think part of the process is sometimes it does, you're like, whoa, I missed 2 weeks, I missed 4 weeks, especially if it's a pod fading, it's starting to fade, literally, like, or maybe you get one in the feed a month, maybe the next time it takes 2 months, and then you finally decide. What's that decision process? Is it just because you realized, Roberto, is it just because you realized, man, either I'm not feeling it or I'm not putting out enough content, I guess that's telling me to go? Or, is there a way, how do you decide? Is there a way to re-energize yourself for that topic?
From personal experience, I truly feel like I was just burnt out and with my movie trailers podcast.
On the subject, though, but on this,
Part of it was the routine, because I felt the need that for something that had to do with movie trailers, which, there's new movie trailers dropping every day. So I just felt like in order to be effective at doing this, I had to be putting out an episode a week to be able to to stay on top of what was the kind of the newest stuff coming out and where the conversation was. I wasn't gonna, let's say this week the latest Captain America movie trailer drops. I'm not gonna wait till next week when everybody has the conversation has faded about it. I want to get it out this week when the conversation is hot and people could potentially find the podcast. So I just felt having to stay on top of that weekly schedule. Eventually, I had told my wife was my co-host, and I said, when it stops being fun and it starts to become just this exercise in I'm stressing out because I'm supposed to get an episode out, I'm not doing it because I'm enjoying it, I think that's kind of when it's time to say goodbye.
But the thing is, you didn't lose the passion for movies, right?
I did not.
Your format forced you out.
I must say that for at least 6 months after my last episode, I had a sweating and stressing reaction every time I saw a movie trailer. For whatever reason, it was like a traumatic. I was reliving
PTSD, my friend. It's called PTSD.
Whatever that green screen
I'm not making fun of
that says preview, whatever. I started getting palpitations when those trailers got started. So it did have an impact. And I for a while I had to just step away from it because it just got to be too much. But yeah, it wasn't that I lost my passion for movies and stuff. It was just I was not enjoying doing the podcast anymore.
Yeah, so I mean so here's the thing, even with the Podcaster Studio, which is my show about how to podcast, other than this one, which we'll talk about that. Maybe that's an issue, right? You started another one, but this isn't a how-to show. You got that, people? This is a discussion, all right? It's a very important distinction there. But even with that show, I'm thinking, how could I change it? I did this with my YouTube channel. I wanted more content on my YouTube channel because with YouTube, with podcasting, with blogging, any of it, being consistent is the key to growing to your full potential. It's one of the keys, right? Being consistent, obviously, if you're a content producer, you need to produce content. And it can't be once or twice or 4 times a year if you really want it to sort of catch on and be seen and people to follow you. So with the YouTube channel, I just gave myself different types of video to create, things that were lower production. So tweaking the format, which I may even do with the Podcaster Studio in order to not pod fade, because the thing is, the passion for the topic is not gone. The format of the show may be what's making it difficult. So Mario, you talked about working with like 3 co-hosts. So you're like, I still like this topic, but this format is holding it back, right? So what do you guys think? Have you guys tweaked formats of your show? And what was any of it to do with have you tweaked your show, and what was the reason? I guess I will just leave it open.
Mine was editing.
Go ahead, Mario.
Mine was an editing thing. I told the other 2 co-hosts that I'm just going to stop editing, so we just have to be careful of what we say and how we say it, and if anybody wants to tweak it, they have to edit it themselves. So we just put it out there once we're done.
It's better than the show going away, right? At least from perspective, probably. I mean, if you just made it bad, but you didn't make it bad, and as we go along, more episodes in, the better you're going to be on the microphone. And this show is not edited. I mean, I put this out raw. I chop off the start and stop. There's no music. That is, this show was made to be quote unquote easy. A podcast is still hard, even at its easiest level. But Daniel, what were you
I tweaked the format of one of my podcasts, and it pod faded
because of the tweak. So why was the tweak made? That's the important part.
Well, it was my comedy podcast, which we are back to hosting that now, just on a different schedule. But we used to host that podcast weekly, an audio podcast. And in early 2015, we said, all right, we've done 200 episodes and 3 seasons. I think we called it 3 seasons or 4 seasons. Don't try and figure out that number. It doesn't make sense. But we said, we're going to change this from being an audio podcast to a video podcast. The episodes will come out less frequently. They'll be significantly shorter, but the format will be extremely different. And so then we said, we'll be back. Don't worry, we're not going anywhere. We will be back, and we'll be back as a video show. That never happened.
To ruin it. We'll be back to blow it up.
Famous last words.
They were famous last words.
Yeah, with the video, what we were finding is there wasn't the focus, there wasn't the commitment to make it. It was not working for us, and we realized we can't do this. as a video. Let's bring the show back. And actually, I did put out one video in the feed to say, all right, we couldn't do what we said we were going to do. If you want to see the show come back,
we didn't mean it.
if you want to see the show come back, then support us on Patreon. And if we reach this certain milestone, we'll bring the show back. And so we did reach that milestone. And then it dipped below that milestone. And then we said, hey, this could be our last episode unless our milestone is reached again. And then it raised back up to that milestone. So we're back to our audio format on that show.
Nice. So Dave, I have to ask you, because when I went back and I looked through the episode where he said making tough decisions, one of the things we talked about when that short section about pod fading was logical weight loss. So since 8/15, it was in August of 2015 was that episode, and I think it was you were teetering on the edge there. Is logical weight loss? Did it pod fade? Did you stop the show? What happened?
It hasn't yet, but I am running out of.
It's not fading.
Yeah, it's a little bit. Yeah, where it was every week. Like I didn't do one this week. I'll probably do one maybe tonight to get it ready for Monday. But I even said to my audience, I've kind of said all there is to say. I'm losing weight, and they're like, "Well, stay, and then you can tell us how to maintain your weight once you hit your goal." And I'm like, it's still going to be eat less, exercise more. I'm like, so I'm kind of
just listen to the last episode over and over and over.
And kind of the same thing with my marketing musician. I don't play in a band anymore. I even rebranded that show, got a custom theme song made, just put all this effort into it, thinking it was going to re-inspire me. And in the end, it was kind of like I still got nothing to say. And so when it takes a long time to find content, and I even cut out. I used to do interviews. I just made it a solo show. I tried all sorts of stuff, but in the end, I was like, I don't know. The music business is hosed. Nobody's making money at that. So good luck. Have fun.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Start a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. That was
Get
it.
a real job.
Yeah. So no, it hasn't pod faded, but it's getting harder and harder to find content that gets me excited enough to turn on the microphone.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about. We've all kind of talked about things that we've done to prevent pod fading, but let's talk a little bit about that. So if, Mario, how have you prevented pod fading across any of your shows, or re-inspired a show, or, if you do it long enough, there's going to be valleys along with the peaks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things for me is looking at my feed and seeing 0 new episodes, and seeing that other podcasters have released 10 episodes. I'm like, okay, I need to just get back out there. My podcast itself, they kind of led me into the music industry. Dave, there's probably a lot to talk about still, trust me. But with that kind of pulled me away a little bit. Even though I was doing exactly what I was podcasting about, the local music scene in San Antonio, Texas, and I'd be out there and people would say, hey, you haven't put out an episode in a while. And I don't, as podcasters, some of us, I have an issue with getting a lot of feedback from listeners. So when I see them in person, face-to-face at a show, and they come up to me afterwards and say, hey, your last episode was a month ago. Are you going to do any more interviews? That kind of helps light a fire back under me, and I start trying to get stuff scheduled and try to get some content together. And sometimes it's difficult with musicians because you email them and say, hey, send me your music and I'll play it on the show, and they say, oh, we're excited, we'd love to. 6 months later, it's like, hey, just wanting to see if you're still interested. So sometimes a flood in of new content helps that as well. I'll be like, oh, I don't have anything else at this moment, and then suddenly 5 emails come in and I've got 5 albums worth of music that I can put out, and that helps. Content that's being given to you is extremely helpful.
Yeah, I think engagement helps a lot, right? I mean, so maybe that's one good reason to be social, right? If it's easier for people to engage with you, it can be very motivating. I mean, someone even just making sure that I use TweetDeck on Chrome, and for a long time I didn't like tweets or starred them or whatever they did, and then I made sure that I was notified when that happened, and it turned out tons of people are liking your tweets. There's a lot of interaction going on you don't even know about, and that can be motivating. You're like, oh, people really are reading this. They are really, or they can say, hey, like that. They might not see you in person, but they might say, hey, you're going to do another episode, or I really love this last episode. So that can be That can be really that can be the fuel that keeps the show going in those sort of valleys. Now, Roberto, you're a true pro. You won't hear this in the audio because he sneezed or coughed. He muted it for him, so we have podcasters here. Let's talk a little bit about Daniel. You mentioned this in the lead up before we did this a couple days ago. The perspective as a subscriber. So as a podcast listener, when a show pod fades. Now, you talked about Ask a Ninja, and several of us said, yeah, we love that show, and it kind of went away, and we sort of, felt nostalgic for it. But, I'm curious, Roberto, I imagine you listen to podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
Have you been subscribed to a show that sticks in your head that went away, and how did you feel about that?
Yeah, I remember. I don't know if there was a website called GDGT that it was spelled. They would mention a gadget by Ryan Block and Peter Rojas, and they had a podcast that kind of was a companion to the website, and they just let it fade out. And I remember being disappointed that they never picked it up, and again, never like the person who asked here earlier. Do you owe it to your fans to give it some closure? I felt like it needed some closure. Like, it would have been nice to be told, hey, we've decided we're now dedicated fully to the website and don't have the time to podcast anymore. Just 2 minutes to just kind of put it out there and say why they had to kind of let it go. But so yeah, I've had that experience as a listener, and I think having had that experience is what led me to want to do something when I saw that Trailer Clash was starting to fade away, that I needed to at least put that message out there. It was 2 or 3 months after the show's last episode, and I figured, okay, I owe it to my fans, and I kind of owe it to myself too. I wouldn't like to be left hanging, so let me at least not leave people hanging and put a message out there that the show is not coming back.
Yeah. Anyone else subscribe to a show that went away, and how you felt about that? Being on the other side? Lots. Lots of shows pod fade. I mean, but here's the thing. Daniel, do we know how many podcasts are submitted every day now? I mean, it's like crazy.
It's something like 3,000 to 5,000 a week.
A week.
Wow.
That's crazy. I mean, Dave used to do a show where it was news if a podcast came out.
Yeah.
Right? Now it's just the flood. The gates are open, man, and everyone's coming through. So you're going to see almost certainly, I'm just guessing, that the number for shows that don't stick around for a year, 6 months, is higher than the number of shows that do. Wouldn't you think? So a lot of listeners are having this experience. So any shows you guys can think of, or not even show specific, but do you remember, or do you still have it in your feed?
One of my favorite shows of all time, Podcheck Review, by a guy named Scott Fletcher, who invented the phrase that ties right in. He's the guy that invented the phrase podfade. And
see, that's why we have the old guys on the show.
Right.
We have history here.
And one of the things, of course, that really aided to him not doing his podcast anymore, babies. I believe he had a child, and and he actually, I think, got completely out of podcasting. He still does voiceover and things like that, but it was hilarious. It was like a tech news show, and he was just so sarcastic, and he'd make fun of it. It was awesome. And I would love just to find like an old iRiver, like in a shoe somewhere in a closet, to find an old episode of that. It was so great.
Well, you said he came up with the term pod fading, right?
Right.
How? Like in a podcast? Or obviously, if he pod faded, it didn't come up with it in the podcast.
Yeah, it was something where, even back in 2005, there were people that getting into it, and then they just quit. It would just dry up on the vine. And somewhere he said pod fade, and we all laughed. And
we got to find that history. We need that little piece of history, that nugget. We need that. We need to document that. Stick it in the archive. If you didn't know, we are building a museum, Daniel, Dave, and I. That will happen. There will be a podcast museum. There's a Hall of Fame, but it's not a physical place you can go to.
That's right.
Maybe a podcast Hall of Fame or museum should not. It has to be virtual, right? You can't actually go to it. You can't go to it.
You would have to subscribe to it, really.
You have to subscribe to get in. Yes.
And then hope it doesn't pod fade.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that's the joke. We were going to close up shop after 7 weeks. We were done.
It's in Second Life.
Oh, that's a good idea. Does that still exist? Can you actually go into Second Life?
I don't know.
Come on, I know one of you goes in every day.
While we're talking, I just looked at my podcast subscriptions to see what of the podcasts I'm subscribed to have pod faded. And what I'm defining as pod faded is if I see their last episode was fall of 2015 or earlier, and it's now March 2016, so 6 months or so, then I'm deleting it. I just deleted 4 or 5 podcasts. There's this one here that I'm very, very tempted to delete. It's called Podcast Quick Tips with Ray Ortega. Last episode, January 2014.
That's a legit. So that's a legit pod fade. It went away, and I'll tell you that is one that fully intends to come back because it's not. It's an easy show to produce.
So can I delete it or should I stay subscribed?
It's up to you, man. The suspense. It's you're the one that's gonna miss out when it comes back. Almost certainly, you should delete it. Get that garbage. Get the junk off the screen. I would have no problem with that. You should definitely delete it. You know, oh man, it's a great. I do this for you guys. We need examples to talk about. Right, so I was like, well, I'll just let that one go. It'll make good content 3 years from now when I start this show, when we all get together. Jason Norris in the chat, he said he had some shows that pod faded, and he had trouble when he attempted to be too formal and structured with his podcast. So he decided to podcast every day in January. He didn't concern himself with structure; he just did it. Then he did more episodes daily than he had ever produced previously. Because of his daily podcast, he discovered one niche and 2 others to tackle later. So, you know, sounds like, again, changing things or giving himself the freedom from the way he originally set up the show kept him going, kept that show alive.
You know, that's a good idea, doing some kind of a challenge to yourself. You know, there's my wife does a blogging challenge every year where I think it's during the month of October. You write a blog post every day for the entire month, and what it has done is that it has been intense and it has been very difficult at times, but it has generated then topics that she can then explore more in depth the rest of the year, where she was able to kind of tap on a vein that is, this was a very good blog post that I wrote here, and now I've got content that I can write for my, during the rest of the year she might only write 1 blog post every couple of weeks or once a month, but it's given her kind of that creative kickstart to fuel her through the rest of the year up until the next kind of podcast challenge or a blog post challenge to recharge her batteries at that point.
I had a similar thing happen to me, that the Audacity to Podcast, it's not in risk of pod fading. But I wanted to try something new in 2016. So at the beginning of 2016, I said, I'm going to try to batch produce the Audacity to Podcast. And I tried. And I just discovered batching that show for me does not work. But in my effort to try that, I came up with a list of episodes that I could potentially batch and themes. And so now I have a new list of 100 more episode ideas that I can pull from for the next couple years. And at my rate, since my original list of 35 episodes still hasn't been complete, I don't know, some of these episodes I may not get to for 5 years.
No, I mean, for my wife with this blog post, with this challenge that she did now, she's now realizing that over the course of that month, she wrote enough content that she's going to potentially publish a small book and put it out on, kind of self-published thing, just because she got that opportunity to do that in that intensive, concentrated way.
Yeah, I mean, a challenge can be incredibly powerful. The most famous, maybe the most famous right now, 2016, April. Casey Neistat is a YouTuber. And he was a filmmaker, and he wasn't putting out enough films, he calls them. They're YouTube videos, but they're vlogs. He's got to be the most famous vlogger. And he does this every day, a vlog every day. And they're super edited. I mean, it's crazy. I can't even keep up as a viewer. Somehow he produces these videos every day. But it was a challenge to himself. He wanted to make a vlog every day. And now he is like... He was already known in sort of that space, but now as far as YouTube, I mean, it just doesn't get any bigger. And he's been doing this he started like a year ago or something. I mean, he's got 3 million viewers or something. It's crazy. So that challenge, which was a crazy challenge, actually got him producing more content than before, when he kind of was just letting himself put it out whenever. And now, I mean, when you have that many people sort of depending on you, I mean, they watch you every day. That also can be tricky, And for me as a podcaster, going back to that perspective from a subscriber perspective, I feel like because I am a podcaster, and a lot of it goes both ways. Almost every podcaster started listening to podcasts first, and once you do a show, you kind of understand a little bit more. Like if a show goes away, it would be cool if they say goodbye. I'd like to just know, is this coming by? Can I take it out of my app, right? But I get it. I know why it's hard. But that's really this bubble that we're in, especially Dave, Daniel, and I, and anyone who listens to this show. You got your head down in podcast about podcast. This is stuff that you focus on. So you hear these stories. You know the trials and tribulations. But so I kind of get it. But as a regular subscriber, someone who's not a podcaster, just a subscriber, I'm sure that's fairly jarring. It's just like, where did they go? Because they did. It's not like. I mean, there's no negative. I mean, it's not like you're going to stop getting money from these people. In some cases, you might now that we have things like Patreon. But for the most case, it's just a courteous thing to do. So in terms of gracefully pod fading, right? What do you think are some tips we can do if you're thinking about it? And I hate the word quit. I absolutely hate the word quit because I think people use it as an excuse to keep themselves being miserable, right? Because they don't want to quit or they don't want to be called a quitter, which is ridiculous. Absolutely, you need to go on and do what's right for you. So if we're considering this, we don't quite know how to get out. We're a little concerned because we do have an audience. What do you think? What as we check out here, this will be it. But we can start, Roberto, with you. Any tips for if you feel yourself pod fading? So again, of course, I'm making this long-winded. If you know you're going to leave, it's kind of not a pod fade, but you are seeing it. If the story is written, it's been 2 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, writing's on the wall. What do we do?
Well, I mean, one way to preemptively not fall into that trap is to end every episode with, this could be the last episode of. so at least if you make it a standard part of your every episode that you do, I guess then everybody you've always warned that this could be the last time you're listening to the show, right? So that would be one way. But yeah, I mean, I think for me is just to realize it doesn't have to be a big thing, just. When I finally decided I had to put something out there, it was a little 2-minute blurb to just say, listen, I've decided that this is just not working out, and thank you for supporting the show, but I'm quitting the show, and to let people know that you're still out there. That if you're doing other things, like David said earlier, it might be a way to prompt people to check out some of. I mean, I have gained listeners from one show who jumped to another because. I told them that, hey, even though I'm not going to be doing this show anymore, I have this other show that I would recommend that I'm doing, and I hope you check it out. So that's one way that I think it doesn't take a lot of time. I think part of it too is that we as podcasters still want to hold on to the hope that we are going to bring the show back. So there's a finality to saying goodbye, and so you just have to kind of do a little bit of soul searching at that point and say, really, is sit down, make your pros and cons list. Is it worth holding on to this and leave people kind of hanging, or is it time to just let it go? And in my case, I felt like it was time to let it go and just make that decision. Like anything, making a decision whether to continue or to not continue, I think is going to make you feel better as the content producer. So whichever way you decide to go with that, to be able to state, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to end it or not, then act on that, I think is very important.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of great stuff in there. Thank you so much. Roberto, thanks for joining us finally on the Roundtable. Sorry it took so long, but hang in there.
My pleasure.
No future Roundtable or pod fades, please. And the thing is, I've gone back to a lot of people and I said, hey, we got a round on this thing that you said you want to talk about. And they're like, hey, I'm not really doing a show anymore. So I run into pod fading all the time, or people who have just decided not to go. Well, just ended their show.
And you had invited me another time before. It's just that time it didn't work out. So
yeah, and that happens.
It wouldn't have been that long.
Exactly. Yeah, don't feel bad if I invite you, it's literally just, are you available? No, we'll get you on another round. So again, thanks for joining us for your first Roundtable. Let us know where we can find you, even when you pod fade. Where can we find Roberto?
So my podcast that I'm currently doing, and we're going through a transition on the website, but it's it's a Game of Thrones podcast, and it's called A Pod of Casts. So if you go to apodofcasts.com, You can learn more about the show there. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Porto Geekin. So I'm from Puerto Rico originally, so it's Porto and then Geek AN. Porto Geekin is my handle on Twitter.
Nice. And, as I'm saying that and sort of joking about it, it actually kind of brings up a thing. It is kind of good to have a central website. So maybe your one show goes away. Like I have RayOrtega.com. It's literally where you can find everything about me. So yeah, one thing may go away, but there's always this hub. And, you may have, like I said, you've got your Twitter. You put your Twitter out there. So the show could go away, but at least we could get in touch and say, hey, Roberto, what's going on, man? So awesome.
And
thanks.
And the podcast, my co-host left last. He decided to not continue, and so it was up to me to decide if I wanted to continue the show. And it was that Twitter community that told me keep going, and so it's encouraged me to keep going with the show.
And that's it. That's that other thing. When you put it out there and you say, this is going to be the last one. I've heard multiple stories where then the audience said, no, you cannot leave. And that was enough. Like the show stayed around. Exactly. You got Roman Mars who threatened his crowd to pay him or he was going to go away. But that actually worked out pretty good for him. He made a ton of money from it. So all kinds of strategies. Well, thanks again. And hopefully we'll see you back. Once a roundtabler, always a roundtabler. So
thank you.
Great content. Mario, thanks so much. If you have any tips along those lines, let us know where we can find your show.
As far as tips, I would say, keep them coming back in, reel them back in. It's kind of like fishing. You lose somebody, you got to throw out a different kind of bait or say, hey, I'm leaving. And then once you get that interaction, sometimes that's good enough. As far as where to find me, we have the It's a Guy Thing podcast.com, 210localmedia.com. I also am, because of the podcast, started a recording, my brain just kind of fizzled there, a music industry kind of thing where we do artist management. We're trying to start a label, and that's at 210localmusic.com, which actually used to be the old name for one of the first podcasts I started. And same thing at Twitter and Instagrams, it's all 210 Local Media, 210 Local Music, and It's a Guy Thing.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thanks again for staying with the roundtable. And really, I think we've been emailing back for a long time, so very cool stuff. Thanks again. And perfect transition to the next box on the other side. He said, because of my podcast, Dave Jackson. That's Dave Jackson. Thanks so much for co-hosting again.
Yeah, I had one of those situations where I went to my audience and said, I think I'm done with this one, which was Weekly Web Tools. And that was one where the audience went, whoa, hold on, don't. I like this one. Go kill logical weight loss or something, So that was enough to keep me inspired. And I said, well, good. Feed me what your web tools are, and I'll be happy to report on them. And that did. It got a lot of people to say, oh, I use this, I use that.
Nice.
So when in doubt, just threaten your audience to leave, and apparently they get off. But on the other hand, on the other side of that, be sure to let the podcast that you're listening to that you don't want to podfade, be sure to say, hey, that was a good episode.
Big time.
That might be the whole email. I like that last episode. Yeah. Keep it up. Yeah. That might keep some gas in a lot of people's tanks. And I'm Dave Jackson from the schoolofpodcasting.com.
Killer tip. We work on International Podcast Day, and we have a day to remote podcasting. It's all year round, but there's one day to celebrate. And one of the things we talk about all the time is reach out. We say on this day, tell your favorite podcaster, I listen to the show, I like it, just say hi, right? But, that is a great tip all year round. If you get a chance, if they're putting the call out, I think a lot of people listen to a show, they hear the call out, you assume someone's doing it, right? But, we hear this story time and again, like as podcasters, it's hard to get that interaction. So make the effort and reach out. It really does. I think all podcasters, I think most of you listen to the show, you know how cool that is when someone reaches out. It really makes it real. You're talking into, and you hear the ears. I don't know, something weird going on. Spin that out to Daniel J. Lewis, co-host. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I am going to continue spinning this with a crazy tip for when your competition pod fades.
Crazy. Oh, wait, we know this gray hat technique, right?
Yes, it is very gray hat, so you have to be very, very careful how you handle this. But it could possibly work for the good for everyone involved, is if your competition pod fades, buy the domain. And maybe you can even take over the RSS feed depending on what they're using or if you can figure things out for what they were doing. I did that for my Clean Comedy podcast several years ago, and it overnight, literally overnight, septupled my subscriptions. Now that's times 7. Now that did drop off significantly since then, but I recently met a guy from Australia who was coming through the Cincinnati area, met up with me and my co-host of the comedy podcast, and I asked him, how did you find the podcast? And he said, remember when you bought that other domain? I came over because of that. I was subscribed to that other podcast. I started listening to yours. I enjoyed it. I stuck around. So it can work. But it's a crazy tip. Be very, very, very careful with that. Handle it with great respect and delicacy. Do not use that for evil. And I am Daniel J. Lewis. You can find all of my links and everything over at theaudacitypodcast.com.
Yeah, and as a counter tip, we'll circle it right back around to the beginning. Don't let go of that domain. We know Dave doesn't let go of any domains.
Nah, never.
Yeah, that's a joke. We're throwing it back a couple rounds, but Dave has a few. Let's just say that. All right, Podcasters Roundtable 70 is next, so we're trucking along. Not pad fading yet, but I guess we don't know it. Yeah, maybe we do know it. We can see it coming. If it's 4 weeks, this is a 2-week show. So, all right, go to podcastersroundtable.com/guest, and that's a nice little chime back there somewhere. My phone's going off, so good time to end. But go to podcastersroundtable.com/guest. Sign up. Like our best buds here, Roberto and Mario, who waited patiently. If you have a show, don't pod fade because we'll get you on this show. And I don't think we're going to do this topic again, so it's not like you can pod fade and then still get on the roundtable. Well, sorry, we talked about. I don't need your experience pod fading.
Now we're committed.
Committed.
Yeah.
Full-fledged. All right. Thanks, everyone. We will see you next time. Wave goodbye. Adios.
Thank you.
Thanks.